And we continue our in-depth conversation about the book that, frankly, every American should read, and certainly every candidate for the Republican nomination for president should read. Here's the cover. It's out this week. It's called Kabul, the untold story of Biden's fiasco and the American warriors who fought to the end. And I want to talk about those warriors now with our guests, the investigative journalists and authors of this book, Jerry Dunleavy and James Hasson. Gentlemen, let's start with you, Jerry. You meticulously go through the events that led to August 26th and specifically that day. How many military personnel on the ground that day did you end up interviewing to get the full picture that you got?
Yeah, we ended up interviewing dozens of people that were present on the ground at HKIA, and to a person, they talked about the danger of the situation that they were put in, an impossible situation where the U.S. military and military leadership was relying on the Taliban to provide security outside of Kabul airport. So you had massive crowds of people trying to escape. They would have to go through the gauntlet of the Taliban turning Americans away, beating Americans, beating our Afghan allies, and killing some of our Afghan allies and civilians in plain view of the military. And these Marines and these soldiers did not have permission to really do anything about that like they would in a normal war because of the situation that President Joe Biden had put them in. And so this was a chaotic and terrifying and dangerous situation.
So I got to pause you there, because if the Taliban is providing the security at the airport and facilitating who gets in and who gets out and even turning Americans away, what exactly were we doing there? I mean, these guys were, I think it was 5,000 or 6,000, if I remember right, who were basically sent back. They had just left, and the Biden administration, to clean up the mess and get rid of the ugly images they were seeing, they sent another several thousand back there. But if they weren't the ones providing security and they weren't the ones protecting Americans from the Taliban, what were they doing, Jerry? Literally, I still don't understand.
Yeah. Well, look, the Taliban was tasked with security outside the airport. These Marines had to try and protect the airport itself. And of course, they were being threatened at all times by ISIS-K and also being threatened by the Taliban. I mean, there were firefights between U.S. troops that were there and some members of the Taliban throughout this evacuation. So they were doing a lot. They also would have to pull people out of the crowd, right? Because a lot of people that were in this crowd, I have no doubt that they were terrified about what life under the Taliban would be. And I have no doubt they probably thought their lives were in danger. But a lot of people in the crowd didn't have a specific connection to America. And so these Marines were having to spot people in the crowd, our Americans and our Afghan allies, like interpreters who had worked with us, would have to get people through, pull people out of the crowd, deal with crowd control.
Okay. But that's after the Taliban's crack security team had already done their initial screening. All right, and just because there's so much to cover, and I want to move it. James, we get to that day, and it appears they had an inkling that something was up, right? Because at various times that day, they thought that they had an actual suicide bomber in their sights. What was the intelligence they had?
Yeah, I think even if you just look at the public statements, and there's way more to it than that, but the public statements of the administration itself started warning that there's a rising threat from ISIS-K to the airfield, et cetera. But then it's very clear that, and if you look at the source interviews in the Pentagon's own Abbey Gate report, it's very clear that that they knew that ISIS was moving to planning to try and hit the airfield. And
so as if they weren't already on high alert with those conditions, this day there was an understanding that there could very well be a terrorist attack that day.
Yes, very much so. And part of the issue was that they were under immense pressure to keep the gates open by the leaders in D.C. because the botched withdrawal led to all kinds of Americans and allies stuck at the back of the mobs outside the gates, unable to get in.
Right.
But what we showed, and it's a narrow point, but it's a very important one. There's a sworn statement from a Pentagon or from a military officer talking about how they created a targeting package for a potential airstrike or drone strike on a ISIS location in Afghanistan, and that the sworn statement states that and that would have had to go up to CENTCOM for approval, but that it basically it was turned down because there were concerns about how the Taliban would react, the negative reaction from the Taliban, who had them surrounded. It's a tough spot to be in, but that's a simple fact. And then there's also another individual who's senior enough that he was briefing foreign attaches and other allies on this intelligence that the attack was likely to happen that day. In his interview, he also said that they had tracked, that they knew that ISIS-K was staging in a hotel 2 to 3 kilometers west of the airfield, and that Major General Donoghue asked the Taliban, who he was in daily correspondence with throughout the evacuation, to raid that location. And of course, the Taliban didn't do so.
Right. And you're right. Listen, tough spot to be in because you're relying on the Taliban, but at the same time, you want to protect your people. You want to preemptive strike against the bad guys. It's a tough spot to be in, but it's the spot they put themselves in the first place.
Absolutely. And none of this would have happened without just a cascade of errors along the way from the administration. It's shocking when you think about it.
Yep.
Perfect
storm of mistakes. Just deliberate mistakes. Jerry Dunleavy, I want to get to probably the most dramatic moments of the books, and that's saying something, and that is when a sniper there believes that he has this suicide bomber in his sights, right? He's got all the intelligence, he knows something's going down, and he believes he's got the guy. What happens?
Yeah, so this is Marine Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews, who actually testified to the committee that I now work for earlier this year. And he testified that, look, U.S. intelligence was sharing intelligence, providing descriptions of the bomber, as well as the likely timing of this attack. And the assessment was that this was going to be at Abbey Gate. And with this description of the bomber, this Marine sniper team believed that they had identified the suicide bomber in the crowd, fit the description, was acting extremely suspiciously. The sniper team asked their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Brad Whited, if they could get permission to shoot the guy. And their commanding officer said that he didn't have the authority to give them permission. They asked him, who can give us that authority? And their commanding officer said he'd check. And according to their testimony, the CO never got back to them. The suicide bomber disappeared into the crowd. The bombing happened, and Tyler Vargas Andrews, the Marine sniper who believed that he had the suicide bomber in his sights, was actually grievously wounded then in the suicide bombing, lost 2 of his limbs, and obviously 13 Americans killed. And so there were opportunities here, I think, is what we lay out. At least opportunities where we could have been more proactive. And one just really quick point to keep in mind is that this suicide bomber, his name is Abdul Rahman al-Aghari. The Biden administration refuses to say his name, but he was freed from Bagram by the Taliban when they took it over. And so holding on to Bagram was not just a good idea to do a safe evacuation. It was a good idea because this guy who carried out the Abbey Gate attack would have still been in prison if we had held on to him.
Yeah, I'll tell you, if people at Netflix or Amazon Prime or anywhere else in Hollywood want to make a dramatization of just this one portion of your book, frankly, about the events of August 26, it would be a blockbuster, let alone the whole thing. Gentlemen, real fast, I've got less than a minute left, so it just has to be a yes or no. Have any of the presidential candidates' campaigns reached out to you two for a briefing on these matters?
Not yet, no. But
I expect that they all.
Yeah, well, they should. They absolutely should. This is the kind of stuff that should cost a man re-election at the very least, and hopefully you two will be able to provide that. I appreciate you joining us. I appreciate you writing the book. Congratulations on the success of it. You've earned it. Well done, gentlemen.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Larry.
There's more to come on O'Connor tonight. Please keep it right here. You're watching the Salem News Channel.